Imagine standing at the mouth of a mine where the ground itself feels like a wound. The air is sharp with coal dust, and beneath your boots lies a grave stretching for miles into the earth. Now imagine the silence after disaster. Not a bird, not a wind, only the weight of earth pressing down, suffocating hope. But then, something impossible. From beneath the rubble, through collapsed stone and twisted beams, comes a sound. Singing. Not faint mutterings, not broken cries, but full-bodied hymns that rise and fall like waves of an unseen tide. This is not a story of survival in any ordinary sense. It is a story of ritual, of men binding their fear into song, transforming agony into defiance. July 1891, Pennsylvania. The twin shaft mine collapse buried nearly 100 miners alive. Families wept above the surface, while below, men entombed in darkness wove their terror into melody. 17 days of singing. 17 days of unbroken voices echoing from beneath the ground like an ancient choir rehearsing for judgment. The newspapers told you these were prayers. But what was happening in the dark went far beyond prayer. And what they brought back up with them was something no official wanted the world to know. The twin shaft mine wasn't just any pit in the ground. It was a labyrinth carved by greed, owned by men who never once dirtied their hands with coal but feasted on the profit of broken backs. It was July 16, 1891, when the collapse came. A thunder like the earth splitting open, walls groaning before they fell, tunnels buckling under tons of rock. 93 men were trapped in that instant, sealed off from light, from air, from the world above. For hours the surface quaked with aftershocks and then, silence. Rescuers clawed at the rubble with bare hands. Women pressed their ears to the cold ground, whispering their husbands' names into the abyss. And then came the first note. A rescuer swore he heard it clear as day, low, steady like a hum. Soon others confirmed, voices, many of them rising together. They weren't screaming. They weren't begging. They were singing. Hymns, yes, but with something in them that felt heavier, older. Not the polished Sunday voices of churches, but guttural chants drawn up from the marrow of men who refused to die in silence. It shook the rescuers. Because who sings in hell? Think about it. The human body in darkness loses sense of time. Minutes become hours. Hours collapse into days. Trapped lungs crave air, minds crave light, but in that cave-in the miners chose song as their weapon. It wasn't simply faith, it was survival. Psychologists later tried to explain it. Rhythm regulates breathing, harmony bonds men in crisis, melody distracts from panic. But those who survived insisted it was more. They said the songs changed the air itself. That when their throats gave way to sound, the crushing silence retreated. That when their voices merged, they could feel each other's heartbeat through stone. One survivor confessed he felt as though the walls of the mine were listening, resonating, almost responding. And that's when the strange reports began. Rescuers above ground swore they heard choirs of hundreds, though only dozens were trapped. Families claimed voices floated up through the night, singing lullabies or calling names. Dreams bled with waking. A mother woke shrieking that her dead husband's hymn was inside her skull. Could it be delirium? Mass hysteria? Or had the miners discovered something no one was meant to touch? Sound as a bridge across the barrier of the living and the buried. The deeper you dig into the testimonies, the more the story begins to crack at its seams. A rescuer wrote in his journal that each day as they drilled, the voices grew not weaker but stronger, as though the men beneath were not fading but gathering force. He described the sound as a great bell tolling in the earth but made of voices. Imagine that. Men dying of thirst, starvation, suffocation. Yet their song grew heavier, fuller, echoing in ways physics could not explain. The company men, the owners, ordered silence. No mention of the voices, no talk of echoes that carried through solid stone. They feared panic, but they feared something greater. That word would spread that ordinary men, bound in darkness, had touched a power beyond survival. That song Unity Will itself could bend the material world. In the age of robber barons and industrial empires, nothing was more dangerous than workers realizing their collective strength. Better to bury their mystery, deny their miracle, than risk a spark of awakening. So the company sealed records, bribed papers, and told families to call it faith. But those who were there knew it was something else. Something forbidden. 17 days. Think of it. 17 days of darkness. 17 nights where time collapsed into nothing, where men counted not hours but heartbeats, stitched together by melody. Above, families lived in torment, listening for phantom echoes. One mother swore she heard her son's hymn each night in her dreams, his voice as clear as when he was a boy. Another woman said she felt hands pulling her from bed, guiding her to the mine entrance at the very moment rescuers reported a swell of singing below. The line between above and below blurred. The miners were no longer entirely buried. Their voices pierced the boundary between life and death, binding themselves to those who listened. And then, suddenly on the 17th day, the voices stopped. Silence fell like a blade. Rescuers dug frantically, and when they finally broke through, the survivors they pulled out were shadows of men. Their skin pale, their eyes hollow, their bodies gaunt. Asked why they sang, they gave no answer. Some refused to speak of it ever again. But those who saw their faces, who met their eyes, understood. The singing had not been for comfort. It had been for something else. Something we were never meant to hear. The men who survived the collapse were not the same men who had gone into the shaft. Rescuers expected joy, relief, gratitude, but instead what greeted them was silence, heavy and unnatural. Survivors refused to sing again, even when begged to by families who wanted to hear the melodies that had held them alive. Some muttered incoherent phrases about keeping the darkness at bay, or feeding the stone with sound. One miner broke down completely, clawing at his own ears until doctors restrained him, screaming that the echoes hadn't stopped even after the others fell silent. That's when whispers spread among the families. The men hadn't been rescued, not truly. They had been returned. Return changed. The papers, owned by the mining companies, printed only sanitized accounts of bravery and prayer. But in hushed corners of taverns and kitchens, women swore their husbands' eyes looked older than the earth, as though something in the pit had stared back at them. Children woke at night crying from nightmares where their fathers sang, their voices not their own. This was not survival. This was transformation. And transformations are dangerous when they cannot be controlled. Rescuers described something else, something they were told to forget. As they tunneled closer to the trapped miners, they reported feeling vibrations in the stone, as if the rock itself were resonating with the men's voices. Not just noise but rhythm, pulse, almost heartbeat. One rescuer said he could feel it in his chest, in his bones, as if the earth was trying to synchronize with him. When the miners were finally reached, the tunnels bore strange patterns. Dust settled in spirals, tools lying in odd arrangements, wooden supports humming faintly. Officials dismissed it as hallucination, the product of exhaustion. But the miners themselves gave another explanation. They said they had learned to move the air with sound. To call echoes to carry further, to feel vibrations in walls guiding them toward pockets of breathable space. And perhaps most chilling, they claimed the songs had told them when to stop singing. That silence itself had been commanded. If this was true, then their survival was not merely luck. It was communion. But with what? With each other? With the earth itself? Or with something that dwells deeper still, waiting for voices bold enough to awaken it? This is where the story leaves the realm of simple disaster and enters the shadowed corridors of forbidden history. For within weeks of the rescue, investigators arrived. Not priests, not doctors, but men in suits representing government and industry. Survivors were interviewed behind closed doors. Families were paid to keep quiet. Journalists who pressed too deeply suddenly stopped writing. Why such silence over a mining accident? Because the whispers among the men suggested something revolutionary. That sound, collective sound, had given them power. Power to endure, yes, but also power to influence the material world. One survivor spoke in confidence to a priest, saying that at times their songs seemed to move loose rock, to open small channels where no air should have flowed. He begged the priest never to repeat it, but the word spread like wildfire among the townsfolk. Imagine what that meant to an era of brutal labor, where workers were treated as disposable. If men could prove their unity carried a force greater than the chains binding them, they could shatter industries. They could shatter empires. And so, the story had to be buried deeper than the miners ever were. There's another layer to this. Records show that in the weeks after the collapse, strange incidents plagued Pittston. Families reported hearing phantom choirs drifting through the streets at night. Entire households woke to the sound of men singing underground, though the survivors swore they had not opened their mouths since their release. Horses refused to go near the mine. Dogs barked at empty air. One woman wrote in her diary that she saw her dead brother walking through her yard, lips moving silently in the same hymn he had sung in the pit. These stories were dismissed as grief, hysteria, or superstition. But think carefully, grief does not synchronize across an entire town. And hysteria does not carry melody with perfect unison. Something had been loosed in that mine, something that spread beyond its walls. The miners had sung for survival, but perhaps their song had opened a door, a fracture between worlds. And if that door swung open, who could close it again? The company ordered the mine sealed. Officially for safety. Unofficially because the voices had not stopped. Ask yourself, why do stories like this vanish from history books? Why are the miners of Twin Shaft remembered only as another tragedy, another tally of broken bodies, when in truth what occurred was something far greater? Because power does not tolerate mystery. Power thrives on narrative, on telling you what an event means before you can decide for yourself. To admit that a group of starving, suffocating men could sing their way not only through despair but into something resembling communion with the earth, that would be to admit that ordinary people hold untapped forces. And once you admit that, the entire system trembles. Imagine workers uniting not just in strikes but in sound, chanting, resonating, commanding. Imagine voices lifting not in prayer to heaven, but in defiance to the empires that buried them alive. This is why the songs of Twin Shaft were silenced. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important. And once you hear them, even as whispers through history, you are not meant to forget. You are meant to awaken. Picture the mine sealed again, boards nailed over like a coffin. But the voices linger. Families swore they heard them for months. Priests were called to bless the site, sprinkling holy water into black shafts where no sun had ever shone. Yet the singing did not fade. Survivors withdrew from society, working odd jobs or never returning to labor at all. Some wandered aimlessly, muttering half-remembered hymns, unable to look their families in the eye. This unsettled silence was not reported in the papers. Instead, the headlines praised resilience, faith, the miracle of a few men saved from death. But when you read between the lines, the truth seeps through. The miracle was not survival, but transformation. Something had marked them. And society, fearful of what they might reveal, turned them into living ghosts. This is how forbidden knowledge is handled, not by destroying it outright, but by isolating the carriers, making their truth too dangerous, too uncomfortable to repeat. Do you see the pattern? Even now, the details slip from textbooks, erased from collective memory. Because if you knew what those men touched, you might start listening for it in your own silence. Consider what it means to sing in the dark. Not for applause, not for beauty, but because silence itself threatens to devour you. Every note is defiance. Every harmony is survival. When dozens of voices merge, something happens that cannot be measured by science alone. Heartbeats align. Breathing sinks. Fear dissolves into unity. This is where the miner's story crosses into the universal. Their hymns were not about faith in a distant heaven. They were about command of the present. a refusal to let the void dictate their fate. Do you feel it yet? This is not their story alone. It is your story too. Because every day you are buried, beneath noise, beneath distractions, beneath a world that wants you silent. And yet, deep inside, a voice hums, waiting for you to join the choir. The miners discovered it in darkness. They learned that when men merge their voices, they become more than flesh. They become a force. And the reason you never heard this story in its raw truth is because forces like that cannot be allowed to wake the living. The men in suits knew it. That is why investigators arrived swiftly, not to rescue but to control. They asked leading questions. Were you praying? Were you singing hymns to God? They framed the narrative before the miners even had breath to answer. Those who hesitated, those who whispered of strange vibrations and voices beyond their own, were silenced, bribed, or dismissed as delusional. And the press, owned by the same industrial barons who profited from the mines, printed only sanitized tales. Do you see the manipulation? The system cannot allow miracles that bypass its control. If a group of half-dead men could unite and bend reality, then what use is an empire built on hierarchy and fear? Better to teach you that survival comes from authority, from saviors above ground, not from the buried learning to save themselves. This is the secret agenda, to replace your own power with their narrative, to turn transformation into superstition, to label awakening as madness. But tonight, as you listen, the mask slips. And once you see through it, you can never unsee. Let me ask you something dangerous. What if those men had not stopped singing? What if, instead of silence on the 17th day, their voices had grown stronger, breaking through stone, shaking the earth itself? Do you realize what that would mean? A choir of buried men tearing through the physical barrier between life and death, between oppression and freedom. History hints at it. Reports of vibrations, of echoes carrying beyond distance, of rescuers feeling their own bones resonate. If unity can alter the material world, then silence is not just absence, it is suppression. And this is why your silence is demanded in modern life. You are taught to scroll, to consume, to obey, but never to sing with others. Never to unify your voice. Because deep down, power knows. If you found harmony with your buried brothers and sisters, nothing could contain you. That's why the miners' songs were erased. Because they revealed the blueprint of liberation. And blueprints in the wrong hands? They topple empires. We have reached the point in this story where listening is no longer passive. If you have followed this descent so far, you are not the same as when you began. And to seal this transformation, to prove you are not afraid of awakening, I ask you to do something. In the comments, write the phrase, "Voices beneath." Not once but twice. Twice because repetition is a key to resonance. Twice because what you declare echoes back to you. This is not engagement for the algorithm, it is a pact, a reminder that you are part of a hidden choir discovering its own power. The miners sang not to beg, but to bind themselves together against the abyss. And you, here now, are doing the same. Let others scroll in silence. You have crossed into the forbidden, and the mark will remain. When you type those words, you join a lineage of the awakened. The descent has only begun. Sound is older than speech. It is vibration first, meaning second. Ancient peoples understood this instinctively. Before there were written laws, before kings built their palaces, there were chants. Rhythms to call the hunt, rhythms to mark the dead, rhythms to summon storms. Long before Pennsylvania, long before coal, miners in the British Isles sang in tunnels to keep the rock from closing in. In Central Europe, salt miners whispered hymns in the dark to feed the earth, so it would not swallow them. The company men called it superstition. But archaeologists digging much deeper find evidence of something else. Cavities shaped like resonating chambers, stones carved with grooves to catch sound. Even in Egypt, the earliest temples were tuned to particular tones. Why? Because vibration shapes matter. Because a chorus can do what a single throat cannot. When the twin-shaft miners sang, they were not inventing something new. They were stumbling back into an old current, an underworld river of knowledge. The difference? They did it under the gaze of an industrial empire that feared nothing more than workers rediscovering their own power. And so their voices were written off as prayer and their miracle as coincidence. If you doubt this, consider how power uses sound against you. Marching drums to harden soldiers. National anthems to bind strangers. Factory bells to regiment time. Pop music engineered in laboratories to addict the brain. Sound is not neutral. It can liberate or it can enslave. The miners in 1891 found a crack in the wall, a way to use sound as liberation. The barons above used it as control. That's why the company immediately framed their singing as a testament to obedience and faith, rather than a discovery of collective will. Even now, history classes teach you the sanitized version. Brave men praying until help arrived. The narrative is so smooth you don't even think to question it. But here's the psychological hook. If they can control the story of what happened in the dark, they can control how you behave in the light. They bury your possibilities just as surely as they buried those men. But the memory leaks. It leaks through stories like this. Through the crack you're looking at right now. There were survivors who tried to speak more openly. A handful traveled to other towns, telling anyone who would listen about the hum, the feeling of walls breathing with them, the sense of a chorus larger than the trapped men. Some wrote letters to newspapers that never saw print. One man even described, in a faded diary found decades later, how the group had begun to experiment. They would sing one note for hours, then another, noticing how loose stones shifted, how air pockets opened. He wrote of a moment when a beam fell and they all shouted at once, and the beam stopped, trembling before settling harmlessly. Perhaps delirium. Perhaps a story shaped by trauma. But read enough of these fragments and a pattern emerges. They were not just singing. They were shaping. And shaping is power. In a world built on keeping you powerless, this knowledge could not stand. The miners were turned into martyrs, their songs into pious legend, and their diaries into locked archives. The rituals of suppression are always the same. First comes the narrative. You were helpless and were saved by the benevolence of authority. Second comes the erasure. Your strange experiences were hysteria. Third comes the substitution. A new story, safer, sweeter, easier to teach. The miners of Twin Shaft went through all three. But a few records survive in the cracks. Rescuers' journals, widows' letters, even the recollections of children now grown old. These tell a different story. A story of defiance in darkness. A story of men who refused to surrender to the void, who discovered that together they were more than victims. And that is exactly why you are hearing it now. Because you are not meant to be a passive consumer of tragedies. You are meant to see the pattern. Once you see it, you can recognize it everywhere, in headlines, in policies, in the very rhythms of your day. You may already be humming without knowing why. Pause for a moment and feel your own heartbeat. That steady pulse's vibration is the oldest drum you know. Now imagine dozens of heartbeats aligning, breath matching breath, voices merging into one sound. That is what happened in the pit. That is what terrified the suits. This is why sound, when it's collective, is policed. Whether it's chants at protests, songs of rebellion, or even the wrong kind of speech online. You are taught to believe in individual expression but to fear collective resonance. Because resonance topples structures. This is the miners' final hidden legacy. Not their suffering but their blueprint. They showed, accidentally or instinctively, that ordinary people can generate extraordinary force when they vibrate together. You have been walking with ghosts through these sections, but the ghosts are not asking for pity. They are handing you a key. Whether you use it or scroll away in silence is your choice. The descent continues, but so does the climb out, if you know how to sing. Deep within the archives of forgotten history, you find echoes of the miners' ordeal repeated across centuries. In Wales, iron miners once claimed that voices echoed in shafts before collapses, warning them of death. In Peru, the Inca believed caves were mouths of the earth, hungry and alive, soothed only by chants. In Siberia, shamans carried drums into caverns, beating them until the walls shook, claiming the stone answered back. These fragments tell you something your textbooks never will. The earth has always been seen not as dead matter, but as a resonant body. The men of Twin Shaft did not stumble into madness. They fell into a tradition as old as humanity. But their misfortune was to discover it under the watchful eye of empire, at a time when human beings were reduced to tools. What the ancients called communion, the company called hysteria. And yet the pattern is too precise to ignore. Wherever men descend into the earth and sing, they bring something back. Sometimes it is coal. Sometimes it is silence. But sometimes it is knowledge. Knowledge that frightens those who live in palaces built on keeping others in darkness. Why does knowledge like this vanish? Because it cannot be controlled once it is spoken aloud. Imagine if the miners had lived long enough to spread their story across the coal fields. Imagine strikes not with picket signs but with choirs, hundreds of throats chanting in perfect resonance, shaking not only the walls of mines but the foundations of the industry. That is not fantasy. It is the logical extension of what they stumbled upon. Power has always known this. That is why empires invest in silencing certain voices while amplifying others. Consider the Roman Colosseum, where the roar of crowds was harnessed to keep people obedient through spectacle. Consider modern stadiums, where chants are directed into safe rituals of sports rather than dangerous rituals of defiance. Consider how even protests are contained by rules about where and when chanting is permitted. They know what you do not. Sound is power. The miners touched it. You can touch it too. Which is exactly why their story had to be sealed under 17 days of dirt and a century of silence. But the silence could not hold. Rumors spread anyway. In nearby towns, miners whispered that the Twin Shaft men had found the note, a frequency that made stone tremble. Some compared it to biblical walls of Jericho, collapsing when trumpets were blown. Others linked it to druidic chants said to split oak or to Tibetan monks who made mountains hum with their throats. These whispers became dangerous. The company responded with brute force. Firings, blacklists, evictions. Men who spoke of the note found themselves jobless, wandering, sometimes vanishing altogether. Families who repeated the story were ridiculed until they fell silent. This is how suppression works, not always by violence but by ridicule. Make the truth sound foolish enough, and even those who know it begin to doubt their own memory. Yet the rumor lived. A secret passed in taverns and over fires, that deep beneath Pittston, men once sang with such force the earth itself listened. A story so unsettling, it lived only in whispers. But whispers, as you know, can carry further than shouts, if the world is ready to listen. You must understand, the miners' ordeal was not an isolated event. It was part of a continuum. Throughout history, there have been glimpses of ordinary people brushing against forces the elite would rather remain hidden. A peasant rebellion fueled by hymnals that rallied villages like wildfire. Slave ships where chained men beat rhythms that terrified captains who could not stop the sound. Monasteries where monks guarded chants said to open the heart of stone. The miners of Pennsylvania were simply the latest in this long line of forbidden choirs. The difference was time and place. Industrial America did not want mysticism in its minds. It wanted silence, obedience, production. So when the men sang, they broke not only rock but narrative. They disturbed the script. And scripts are sacred to power. Break the script, and suddenly the actors remember they are not characters but human beings with choices. That is what those men risked revealing, that you are more than your role, more than your orders, more than your silence. Now let's return to the image of those 17 days. Imagine the darkness so total it becomes your world. Imagine thirst clawing your throat, hunger gnawing your belly, despair circling your mind like wolves. And then imagine one man, just one, opening his mouth. A note trembling through stone. Another man joins. Then another. And suddenly you are no longer alone. You are part of a wall of sound defying the grave. That was their miracle. Not escape. Not rescue, but defiance. And that is what has been stolen from you every day since. You are taught to endure alone, to suffer in silence, to believe your voice has no power. But the miners proved the opposite. They showed that even in a tomb, voices joined together can create a force that terrifies those above. Their story was buried because it was never about death. It was about life too raw, too ungovernable, too free. And if you carry their echo now, if you feel that hum in your chest, then you are already part of the forbidden choir. You've seen how the miners' voices frighten the company. But what you haven't seen is how their silence after the collapse became a case study. In the decades following Twin Shaft, industrialists hired a new breed of advisor, not just engineers and geologists, but experts in human behavior. They studied riots. They studied songs. They studied the moments when ordinary people stopped obeying. And then they built systems to make sure it never happened again. This is not conspiracy. It is documented. The first employee welfare programs were not about kindness but control. Company housing, company stores, company newspapers. Even the rhythms of work shifts were designed to break natural communal patterns. No more overlapping lunch breaks, no more spontaneous gatherings underground. They understood that if you prevent voices from uniting, you prevent resonance. And without resonance, no wall will shake. The miners' ordeal didn't just bury men. It birthed a model. The model worked because it was invisible. People will fight a visible cage. They will live their whole lives inside an invisible one. Think of how soundproofing works. Not by building a harder wall but by absorbing vibration before it spreads. Power does the same with ideas. A dangerous story is not censored, it is drowned in noise. A dangerous chant is not banned, it is commodified. This is why every revolution eventually gets its own t-shirts. Because once a symbol is packaged, it loses its power. The miner's song could not be packaged. It was not a melody. It was a weapon. And weapons like that must be erased. That is why when you read history books, you will see disasters reported but never their inner texture. You will see 17 men trapped, but not 17 men singing a note that made the earth vibrate. The facts are left, but the force is stripped away. That is how suppression is done. There is something else the company never expected. Survivors. Not of the collapse, but of the story. Old men who had worked other shifts at Twin Shaft remembered the songs. They remembered the timbre, the peculiar way the trapped miners struck the walls with tools between verses as if trying to communicate with the stone itself. These memories haunted them. Some grew convinced that the song was not just defiance but a map, a way out, a code older than coal. One left a notebook filled with cryptic markings, rhythmic notations, fragments of lyrics. It vanished after his death. His family says a state man came to collect it. This is how the rabbit hole deepens. When you follow a thread far enough, you don't just find tragedy. You find theft. Theft of memory. Theft of your inheritance. Do you feel it now? That tug in your gut that something much larger is at play? That's the first crack in the wall. When the miners sang, they weren't just surviving, they were teaching. When you remember them, you're not just watching a story, you're inheriting a method. Power thrives on isolation. It drowns you in distractions, algorithms, arguments, labels until you believe your voice is a whisper lost in noise. But when voices converge, even two, even three, something else happens. This is why regimes fear songs more than speeches, and why every major uprising in history begins not with a manifesto but with a sound. A chant, a hymn, a whistle, a drumbeat. This is why you're still here, still watching. Because part of you is remembering something you never learned but always knew, that you were not born to be silent. This is the moment where the descent becomes a choice. You can treat the minor story as a curiosity, or you can let it mark you. If you're still here, it means you felt the hum. So let's anchor it. Scroll down right now and type this phrase twice. The echo is alive. Don't just comment it. Speak it under your breath as you type. This is not a gimmick. This is how you turn a story into a signal. When hundreds of you do this, it tells the algorithm that something unusual is happening here, but more importantly, it tells you that you are part of something larger. That's how identity shifts. That's how the invisible cage cracks. If this is your first time on this channel, subscribe now. Not as a transaction, but as a vow. Because what we are about to uncover next goes deeper than a mine, deeper than song, deeper than history. It goes into the machinery of control itself, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When the mine closed, the story should have ended. Instead, it shifted above ground. The same men who engineered the suppression of the miners' song began consulting for newspapers, railroads, telegraph companies. They understood what few yet grasped. Information travels like vibration. Control the vibration, control the mind. In the early 1900s, they called it public relations. In the 1950s, they called it psychological operations. In the 2020s, they call it content moderation, engagement, narrative shaping. Different names, same principle. Tune a population to a safe frequency, cancel the dissonant notes before they spread. The miner's 17-day chant was a data point, a warning of what happens when resonance escapes the lab. They built a century of systems to prevent it happening again. Consider how easily your attention is managed now. Every feed is an engineered shaft. Every notification a pickaxe. You scroll deeper thinking you're exploring, but someone has mapped the tunnels ahead. They know where you'll pause, where you'll react, which note will make you stop. That is why stories like the twin shaft collapse are presented as quaint curiosities rather than living instructions. You're allowed to consume tragedy, but not to recognize pattern. This is why conspiracy forums erupt and collapse. They're permitted as pressure valves, noisy, chaotic, no resonance. True resonance is different. It is quiet, disciplined, collective. It doesn't scream. It hums. It organizes. And it terrifies the system. The miners were not saints. They were desperate, coughing, dying men. Yet they stumbled on a principle that elites pay fortunes to study in think tanks. Entrainment. When multiple minds and bodies align in rhythm, something larger than any individual emerges. Soldiers march to drums for a reason. Crowds chant at rallies for a reason. Neural circuits sync. Hormones shift. Decision-making changes. Suddenly fear dissolves. Suddenly courage becomes contagious. That is what those men discovered under the dirt. They did not invent it. They remembered it. And when they remembered, they became dangerous. Ask yourself, who benefits when you forget? This is why you were taught that singing is performance, not power. This is why you were taught that history is dead, not a living code. This is why you were taught that ancient rituals were superstition, not technology. Every age buries its miners, the ones who dig too deep, the ones who bring up more than coal. But if you're still watching, you're already breaking that spell. You're seeing the pattern. And patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. From here on, everything you notice in the world, chants at games, slogans in politics, trending sounds on apps, will look different. You'll hear the hum behind the noise. That hum is the same one those men created in 1891. It never died. It was just waiting for someone to listen. Pause for a heartbeat. This is not entertainment. This is initiation. You have been led from a mine collapse in Pennsylvania into the machinery of modern control. You've been shown how sound, story, and structure are used to shape your reality. You felt the tug in your chest. That is not my doing. That is you remembering. From here the descent gets sharper. We will follow the trail from the coal shafts to the boardrooms, from hymns to algorithms, from the hum under Pittston to the hum under your own scrolling. The next sections will expose names, dates, and methods that were never meant to be tied together. If you're ready, breathe out slowly. Whisper once more, even silently, the echo is alive. You're not just an observer anymore. You're stepping into the forbidden choir. If you trace the paper trail far enough, you find the same surnames reappearing. Executives from the coal companies moving into banks, newspapers, and railroads. Families whose fortunes began in the mines now shaping policy in Washington and New York. They didn't just bury bodies, they buried a method, then built empires over it. The miners of Pittston were a warning. A small group of untrained men, starving and trapped, had stumbled onto a resonance powerful enough to shake stone. What might happen if a free, fed, educated population discovered the same? Whole nations could unseat their masters without firing a shot. The secret of control has always been to keep the many out of rhythm, distracted, scrolling, isolated. That's not paranoia. That's policy. Even now you're inside a mine. Not of coal but of data. Every click and scroll leaves a trace. Every emotion you feel online is mapped and stored. Algorithms predict your mood better than you can. They feed you noise calibrated to cancel your hum. Yet inside this digital shaft, the old power still fears the same thing it feared in 1891, resonance. That is why spontaneous, unscripted movements are infiltrated and fragmented. That is why voices that hum too deeply vanish or are labeled crazy. The mind changed shape but not nature. The only way out is the same way the miners found, through a sound, a signal, a shared rhythm that makes the walls tremble. Imagine what would happen if millions stopped scrolling separately and started humming together, not literally but in action, intention, clarity. The entire structure built to contain you would begin to shake. This is not a call to riot. This is a call to remember what you are. The miners didn't destroy their captors. They remembered their power and passed it to you across time. That's why you're hearing this now. This is not nostalgia. This is an instruction. That hum in your chest is the beginning of freedom. You can try to silence it or you can feed it. So here's the last layer. The miners were not rescued because the company cared. They were rescued because the ground itself gave way under the pressure of their song. Rescuers later claimed to have heard faint vibrations through the stone before the breach. Officially, they called it luck. Unofficially, some swore the men had carved their way out with sound. That notebook with markings? Gone. The company's own telegraph logs for those days? Missing. It's as if the mine swallowed not just men but proof. Yet the echo survived. It survived in whispers, in workers' songs, in union hymns, in the way you're leaning closer now. That's how forbidden knowledge works. You don't learn it. It awakens. Now you know why this story matters. It's not just about 1891 Pennsylvania. It's about every shaft you've ever been lowered into without realizing, every job, every feed, every box, every story that told you to be quiet. It's about the difference between noise and resonance, between isolation and choir. It's about the power buried inside ordinary people and the centuries spent trying to keep it underground. If you've made it here, you've already felt the shift. Don't let it fade. Scroll down now and comment once more. The echo is alive. Let that phrase be your signal to others who've walked this descent with you. Subscribe if you haven't, not for me but for yourself, so you stay in the current as we go deeper in future episodes. Because this isn't the end. This is the first breath after the mine. This is the moment you realize you're still alive and your voice still carries. Listen closely. The hum is waiting. And it's your turn to sing.